Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 47, entitled Pioneers. I wanted to say a few things about our parallel community discussions and efforts. Not just our regular Sunday discussions, which I highly encourage you to check out if you haven't been doing so already, but all connected efforts, including the Guilded server that's been set up to better facilitate them, that I also strongly recommend you check out. First, I wanted to extend a thanks to everyone that has stepped forward, especially those that have spoken and shared their thoughts, ideas, experiences. With each successive Sunday discussion, things feel a bit more grounded, focused, and purposeful, and I think we're definitely headed in a good direction. Having said that, we need to recognize that what we're attempting here is something big, and not some easy and straightforward and clearly defined task. In many ways, we don't have much precedent to pull from to help guide us. Not only is our modern world of right this moment so different than virtually any period in history, but our situation within it is fairly unique too. For example, I'd suggest that the opposing ideological or philosophical or spiritual force is now very much international in scope and character. And I'd suggest that our allies and potential allies are too. This aspect alone puts us in unique territory. And I wanted to take this opportunity to speak to this broader topic specifically, namely the question of how we should best strike the balance between being a large tent and accommodating as many potential allies as is possible, to at least loosely unite these in networks of mutual assistance, or creating an extremely small tent and only working with those who are already of like mind on all topics of the greatest import. I don't mean to be dismissive of either extreme on these spectrums, because both certainly have their merits, and I hope we might, largely, come to agree on and recognize this. I believe the ideal, in this case, is a balance somewhere between the two. We don't want to have to work with people whose fundamental outlook or worldview is something we disagree with, but we also don't want to whittle ourselves down to the tiniest handful of people and lose our ability to act meaningfully and network powerfully. I'd like to make clear that my own opinion as to how this might unfold and how these parallel community discussions and efforts might manifest is that we're not laboring to create one single perfect community that checks all of our boxes. At least, I don't think so, and at the very least, not yet. A better overview of what we're attempting to do is to help create several small communities that might choose to walk slightly different directions, and yet strongly support one another and act as a meaningful part of the overall network as they do so. I think most of you know that I'm not the biggest fan of our modern idolization of, quote, compromise and, quote, tolerance. And I've said quite a bit about just how counterproductive and net negative these approaches have been. And I think the vast majority of you listening tend to agree and can clearly see what a destructive force our embrace of these notions has been. But if we were ever going to exercise these impulses, I think this would be the time and place, namely amongst the similarly minded, as we're all engaged in a time-sensitive effort to create some solid ground to stand on, as things begin to collapse around us. This certainly doesn't mean we should compromise our beliefs or who we are, or tolerate individuals or behaviors we're diametrically opposed to. But it does mean that I think we'd be well served to try our best to treat one another as friends, or at least potential friends, and as often as possible try to seek common ground, as opposed to seeking out possible points of contention. A great example is the unfortunate spiritual rift between good Christians who believe that Christ and his doctrine is the only way to defeat the forces aligned against us, and the people of the lie that seem to hold so much of the world in their sway at the moment, and between those who see Christianity itself as the handiwork of these people, and a siren song ideology crafted into what it is today to keep people impotent, controlled, misled. It always disappoints and saddens me to see these two factions butt heads, especially in arenas in which it's simply not at all necessary at the moment. I do believe these are the greatest outstanding questions to answer and issues of the greatest importance, to the extent that in the coming years, I think we should strive to be on the same page, and first and foremost on the right page, to be able to move forward in lockstep and complete unity. I have so much I'd like to say on these topics, and hope to very soon, but for now, I just wanted to say this. I feel like I completely understand and sympathize with both sides of this dynamic. I feel like there's truth to both, and if pressed to do so, I could likely make a convincing case for both arguments. Modern Christianity has been increasingly turned into Judeo-Christianity in the past several decades, especially since the 60s and 70s, and the incredibly successful Zionist infiltration and co-opting of church leadership, much of which I've witnessed almost firsthand. This is a big part of the reason the modern church has become something akin to an arm of the social justice movement. But the foremost parties behind this devolution of the church are the same types Christ himself sent flying out of the temple with a bullwhip, and there's a reason they so hated the man, and still do hate the man and his doctrine. There's a reason the Talmud speaks of him with such petulant and fiery hatred. I'm using just a few sentences here to summarize what deserves at least an hour or 2 or 3 of focused discussion, and I'm never a fan of this type of thing. But I do it to say this. In our discussions in our Sunday meetings and on the Gilded Server, and in all other arenas in which we collaborate and work together in any capacity, I'd strongly prefer that we try our best not just to avoid friction, but to avoid opening the door to any friction, meaning even avoiding discussion of these most contentious issues when it serves no helpful purpose to do so. I'd even like to see us recognize and keep in mind the fact that the first priority of any subversive forces seeking to derail or hamper these efforts and discussions would be aimed at creating this very friction and demoralizing and creating warring factions, and resulting from this recognition, doing whatever little bit we each can to help stymie these efforts. This might be reining in a conversation that is veering into an ego battle or a pissing contest, or any cases in which one side of an argument is lazily and unjustly stereotyping the other, even cases where, quote, sides are developing at all. The mood and environment and atmosphere of these efforts and all resulting discussions is of very real importance. I appreciate those willing to consistently aim to be a net positive force here. It really does matter more than most of us might know. Part of the reason for this is that nothing meaningful can be accomplished with just 1 or 2 discussions. The key to all of this is that we recognize the importance of these efforts and their necessity, we might even say time-sensitive necessity, and that we stick with them. You might think of these ongoing discussions as comparable to doing the physical work to construct a house. A plan needs to be formulated, a foundation needs to be laid, a frame raised, etc. It'll be a process, fleshing these ideas out, and creating enough structure to where we are all able to begin envisioning what the next many steps might be, or roughly what things might look like when complete. And because this is a process, and because we'll need to have many more discussions and get to know one another and learn to communicate effectively, a big part of our goal needs to be to make these discussions, of course, fruitful and efficient, but also engaging, even entertaining and enjoyable. And this holds true both for the Sunday discussions and all efforts within the Gilded Server. So, in summary, I'd ask you all to try to see those you're working with as your brothers, unless you've been given some definitive reason to believe otherwise, and to do what you can to be tactful and diplomatic at all times, and avoid all prospects and potentiality of infighting. It's likely that we're about to enter some very heady times, and we'll need all the allies we can get and the most significant broader network of allied forces that we can muster. So let's keep this in mind and act accordingly. And this leads nicely to the next topic. Some have asked why we're doing this when things like this have already been done. In other words, why not merely piggyback onto existing similar efforts? I've answered this elsewhere in various forms or fashions, at least to some degree. But in short, it's because this is aiming to be something new. Not merely parallel communities, but parallel communities at least roughly united by a unique philosophy and worldview, with their efforts seen largely as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. And as Arval well put it recently, an unfortunate reality is that a great many existing networks or organizations are rife with federal agents and dishonest actors of various sorts. I'd like this to be a conscious effort from the start to avoid that type of infiltration and subversion and derailment. But having said this, I think one of the ways we might be the most effective and accomplish the most in the shortest period of time would be to focus heavily on discovery and outreach when it comes to individuals and groups doing similar things or already having done similar things. I say discovery because I'd love to see them be somewhat vetted, not necessarily in any rigid, formal fashion, but just having a handful of us become familiar enough with them to where we feel like we have some decent sense of who they are, how closely their ideals align with our own, and then a process of outreach to the best of these, not only inviting them to our Sunday discussions if they wish, and to the Gilded Forum, but adding them to a list and letting them know they can call on us if they need anything, and that ideally we may do the same, especially with simple and direct questions as to their experiences or lessons they've learned, or more pointed questions in regard to specific skill sets they might have. This includes Mennonite and Amish groups, those in South America or South Africa, etc., and perhaps even mutually engaging in some recruitment, if some in their ranks would feel better suited to our efforts or direction, or vice versa. Though I feel this should only be done to the extent that both sides support it and see the value in it. The aim certainly wouldn't be to proactively, quote, poach or steal away good people. And I strongly believe it'd be in our best interest to maintain the utmost mutual goodwill with such groups and communities. And again, to always see them as allies in, at least broadly, common cause. And speaking of Arval, who has done an excellent job hosting the discussions thus far, on his YouTube channel, which I definitely recommend taking a look at, he outlines clearly and capably his belief that education is, and must be, relatively central in all of our efforts moving forward, which is one of the reasons I was interested in having him help host and direct some of these discussions. Pulling back to the broadest perspective, one of our foremost aims should be seen as the recalibration and reorientation of one another. In other words, finding not only our best and brightest, but our healthiest, and drawing these forward to help bring the rest of us closer to that ideal, both in a general sense, but also within specific spheres of knowledge: philosophy, music, literature, physical health, and physical skill sets. Again, I'd like to stress that our goals here can't and shouldn't be seen as simply to live separately, but more broadly to establish new and separate routes of thinking and being, and in some sense to rediscover old ones that formerly worked so well for us. So it's not merely an effort to eliminate dependence on forces that hate us, or to be able to have our own patches of land and our own truly friendly territory, but we absolutely need to work on establishing, reestablishing might be the better term, our own culture, our own idea sphere, our philosophy and worldview and orientation and goals. Parallel communities are both cause and effect here, meaning they'll both help us achieve these things, but also be a manifestation of our first steps on the path toward achieving them. And I hope this makes some sense. There's long been quite a bit of debate about which should come first. Do the communities need to come first to allow the philosophical or ideological or spiritual orientation to take shape? Or do these things need to take shape first, and communities be entirely built around them? There are no clear or perfect answers here, and I think we're in such a tricky and time-sensitive situation that we are really pressed to pursue both simultaneously. Not too hastily, not sprinting forward heedlessly and carelessly, feeling overly pressed by circumstances, but with a slow and steady but consistent pace, and some justified sense of urgency, tempered by the knowledge that these things don't and can't happen overnight. My own personal goal was, and is, to open the door for these discussions, and to work to try to bring the better players to the fore, including, hopefully, some potential leaders and organizers, and then to play some guiding role along the way wherever most helpful. But I'm also intently focused on doing whatever I'm able to help us rediscover and re-embrace that foundational philosophical and ideological and spiritual bedrock. And I've developed quite a few ideas on that front I'm looking forward to communicating in coming months. To give some idea of what I mean here, I don't think most people recognize just how profoundly devastating the type of deracination we've suffered really is. Just how crippling and debilitating it is to have not just your history mocked and belittled and destroyed or rewritten, but to have the most central and all-important conceptions held near and dear by our ancestors. Those foremost principles that helped orient and guide their thoughts and actions, and provide structure and order to their individual lives and their collective communities, completely ripped up from the root and replaced with absolute garbage. It's the worst and most jarring and destructive thing that can happen to a people or a culture. Rediscovering these roots, repairing and rejuvenating, and finding unique ways to embrace timeless principles and modes of thinking and being in a very different and modernized world, or even to communicate the worth and necessity of doing so to the modern mind, is as difficult as it is all-important, and it's a task that will take some time and some doing, and one we can all play some small part in. The first step is in understanding, fully understanding why our prior ways of thinking and living were so vastly superior to their modern replacements. It may be helpful, too, to understand how this culture destruction isn't some coincidental or organic happening, but rather how clearly and effectively it serves a subset of humanity whose monopolistic power completely hinges on this process being successful. I think most of us understand that the immense power of a BlackRock or a Soros or Rothschild-esque banking dynasties, the tendrils of which now extend into every last sphere of our lives, couldn't possibly exist in a truly healthy and robust nation, with a strong sense of their history, their inner nature, and their potential. The dominance of such parasites requires the cultivation of small men, of weak, domesticated, fearful, and disoriented men. And I think most of us understand that it's no coincidence that virtually every last societal trend is very much pushing us in all of these directions. I'd like to give some idea of what we've lost, and what I hope we'll soon learn to rediscover, and what cultural and ideological elements I think we'd be well served to emphasize as we move forward. First and foremost would be to reconnect with our adventurous and pioneering spirit, truly and objectively unrivaled by any other people, if we're speaking honestly and frankly. That urge for new shores and new horizons, to discover and explore new lands, I'd argue both as a means of understanding our world and more fully understanding ourselves and our place within it. I think the ideal is for us to embrace this process as a facet of our new adventure. Yes, we're facing uphill battles and steep climbs, and yes, it might be argued that to some degree we're backed into a difficult corner, having so long fallen asleep at the wheel and relinquished immense power in the process. But all great adventures, like any great accomplishment, require great obstacles and challenges to overcome. There's a reason nearly all of our greatest stories and myths and legends hold to this theme. I strongly believe this was the prudent and immense wisdom of those who came before us, finding the means to provide us across time and space the tools and energy to persevere. The most difficult challenges and obstacles don't frighten or deter or demoralize the healthiest and best oriented men, but rather inspire and motivate and energize. Such things represent their means of proving their mettle and the clearest and most obvious straight line or goal or obvious path forward. To pull back again to the broadest possible vantage point, I strongly believe our goal and role in this life is to be the healing and ordering force, one that's forever opposed by a force that now openly seeks to harm and cause disorder and disorientation, a force that'll never be completely defeated in this material realm and can only be constrained and restrained, its tendrils or vestiges destroyed wherever they might be found in their most clear and obvious and direct manifestation, but never completely eradicated. This term, healing, is used in its broadest possible sense, a sense that doesn't insinuate pacifism, because just as an individual criminal needs to be punished to maintain right order, criminal and chaos-producing ideas and ideologies and factions need to be punished and disempowered similarly. Look around you today. Observe the pace at which not just peoples and cultures and nations are being destroyed, but it would be fair to say the entire planet and its ecosystem and environment and natural balance. Would anyone attempt to argue with a straight face that those currently in highest positions of power really do care about and think deeply about such things and such issues and actively seek solutions? If anyone is still this thoroughly deluded, please give some thought as to why nearly every objective and measurable metric of health, whether it be the physical, mental, and spiritual health of human beings, or the land, or the oceans, or the life within both of these, has been plummeting for some time now. Money is the force the vast majority of people now serve, implicitly. Those men and those factions most responsible for the creation and distribution of money are those that call the tune that the rest of the world dances to. And to the extent that this dynamic continues, we'd be doomed. It really is that simple, despite the never-ending attempts to complicate and introduce subtlety and nuance and unhelpful details and complexity to try to obscure the obvious. This is our present state of affairs. If we can't find some way to be this healing force, and eventually to be so at global scale, the future will be a horrifying place. Parasites are not leaders. They're not men of grand ideas or principles, and certainly not nobility or magnanimity. They're leeches who take what they can whenever and wherever they can. This is their only internal setting or speed or orientation. They know no other. So, for what it's worth, I hope we all might keep in mind the incredible importance of our broader effort here. I very firmly believe that if we don't right the ship, nobody will. Many will come and speak great and lofty words to attain sufficient power, to obtain what they want, materially speaking, from their narrow and superficial existence. But there's essentially zero desire to accomplish anything meaningful along the way. For many, I'm stating the obvious here, but sometimes the obvious deserves to be restated. So, aside from this adventurous and pioneering spirit, what makes us especially unique, innately, culturally, historically speaking? I'd suggest our creative genius is second to none, and that this specific type of creative genius I'm referring to has created and pushed forth nearly everything of great value and worth in human history. It's responsible for nearly all lofty accomplishment, all creations of great and lasting beauty. It's what allowed the Dutch, over centuries, to engage in masterful efforts to regain fertile land from an ever-encroaching ocean. It's the type, for example, that helped the Volga Germans make some of the worst swamplands in the world bloom and flourish, or allowed the Icelanders to turn volcanic wasteland into territory boasting some of the highest quality of life in the world. And, though they weren't free from mistakes or missteps, it's what allowed a handful of conquistadors to triumph over populations vastly larger than their own, and what helped a ragtag bundle of Europeans from every branch in the larger ethnic tree to turn America from a vast expanse, essentially completely free of any development, into the world's greatest and wealthiest superpower in just a few generations. It's what granted the great early Roman patrician leaders their mastery over the organization of men and the channeling of their energies towards greater purposes. It's what primarily fueled the greatest and most inspired artists and thinkers of France, the great generals and martially minded men of Germany, as well as her unrivaled composers, scientists, and philosophers. And it's the innate gift that opened the door for the British to boast the dominance of the world's oceans and craft a seagoing trade and colonial empire second to none. It's also what makes men like Peter Andrews practically magicians when it comes to their understanding of and ability to improve the land. I think it's all important that we again learn to channel and harness this unique creative genius. Ideally, at least eventually, to a degree never before seen. The doors this might open, the latent potential that might be unlocked here, is almost hard to describe or properly put into words. It's world-changing potential, to put it mildly. Another key element to our historical success, I'd argue, has been our work ethic. But this carries with it a huge caveat. I suspect I'm not alone in being mildly uncomfortable with the frequent extolling of the waspish or Protestant work ethic in modern times, because I think it's been so exploited, so misused and abused. Much like those Japanese men willing to work themselves half to death, sometimes literally to death, one has to ask, but for what? The mere financial success of the individual, family, or nation? To live a slightly more comfortable life across the small handful of hours you're not working each day? Or to provide this for their families? This work ethic is a treasure, but one that we should do our damnedest to never allow to be harnessed to any machine that doesn't fundamentally serve our well-being or our highest aims. Working efficiently and effectively toward lofty goals is a beautiful thing. Becoming a pack mule to bear the burdens of an increasingly corrupt and spiritually sick and materialism-obsessed culture is certainly not such a beautiful thing, and it's a perversion and a waste of such a gift. We are even provided with an internal measuring stick as to just how much this gift is being wasted or squandered, and just how much our hard work is directly leading to the greater or higher good. If it feels like a chore, and you have to absolutely force yourself through the motions, in modern times to, quote, just make ends meet, this is the proof. This may sound like a radical notion to some, but I've come to believe it strongly over the years. Namely, if the work being engaged in is clearly fruitful, beneficial, and has higher purpose recognizable to all, it will never feel like mere drudgery. To the extent that it does, it means either this higher purpose behind the work doesn't exist, or it hasn't been properly communicated and understood by the individual engaging in the work. Nearly all occupational work in our age falls into this category, as it's now so far removed from some fundamental and obvious net positive, to the degree that most of us just instinctively view this as the way things are, and perhaps have always been. But this isn't the case. That's not to say it's never been the case at any point in history. The low points of the, quote, Industrial Revolution in Britain spring to mind. But due to the higher homogeneity and cultural and social cohesiveness of nations and peoples of past ages, and the far greater sense of common cause and brotherhood and kinship, for the most part, work was engaged in with a different spirit in the past. We need to bring this spirit back, ideally even in a much more pronounced, refined, and purified form. I'm sure most of you have heard about the ancient Arya, those peoples who likely swept into India around 1500 BC, and who, in my opinion, represented one of the most direct and homogeneous branches of the Proto-Indo-European family. There's long been a raging debate about whether Arya was a purely racial designation, or whether it was applied to those with a unique and innate nobility of spirit. In a purely factual and technical sense, I'd contend that it seemed to have been more of the former, but I rather like the idea that it might have been both, and I'd love to see us embrace this conception moving forward. In other words, merely sharing a racial heritage shouldn't be seen as enough or sufficient, but we should all be seeking to cultivate nobility not just of lineage, but of spirit. Someone made the key and valid point in one of our recent Sunday discussions about how people and relationships between them are always the weak link in such parallel community type efforts or anything similar. And this is certainly true. And if I recall correctly, he asked what the solution to this was. Of course, there's no perfect and foolproof and all-encompassing solution, but a two-pronged approach would help solve or prevent a great deal of the problems that might arise here. The first is to make use of a selection mechanism that doesn't simply allow anyone into any community at any time, but rather tries to match individuals to the best solution for them, and brings in new people into the community slowly enough to where each community might select from a relatively broad pool of applicants or interested parties. And this might be coupled with the idea of banishment or shunning, or some variant thereof, to help prevent the most egregious misbehavior from those already within the community. The second prong would be related to the point about the Arya a moment ago, and would involve a very conscious and aggressive cultivation of a culture of nobility, of trust, loyalty, honor, brotherhood, decency and civility wherever and whenever possible within our own ranks. I strongly believe these concepts should be ingrained and embedded in all that we say and do, in our education, our laws or rules or guidelines, in our manner of association with one another, and even in how we deal with the outside world, to the greatest extent reasonably possible. We should all be aiming to improve one another, not just with regard to our technical skills or abilities, or our breadth and depth of knowledge or skill sets, but morally, ethically, and spiritually. One might even say that the downside is that we have a huge amount of work to do on these fronts, but that the upside is that we have a huge amount of work to do on these fronts. In other words, there's something to be said for standing at the bottom of a massive mountain, knowing that there's nowhere to go but up, and envisioning the beautiful view, the sense of accomplishment, and of course, the greatest learn to even relish the hard climb itself. I love the idea of communities that don't simply labor for individualistic profit motives, but to fundamentally craft better and more capable and just and wise human beings. I think we're now so far from the ideal that many of us have completely lost sight of it, or even its potentiality. Many at present literally lack the ability to imagine and envision it. But I can promise you this, in all sincerity and with complete confidence. In a living situation in which you have real reason to feel a connection and love for your brother and neighbor, in which you're amongst like minds, laboring towards similar aims and goals, in which your expenditure of time and energy is going directly to better this overall path and pace, in which we have reason to once again practice genuine hospitality and feel justified pride and hope, life can be so vastly better than it is now, infused with so much more depth and meaning and vibrant energy, so much more potent and powerful. There's no quick journey or secret shortcut from A to Z in these regards. It'll absolutely take some time and some effort. But a great starting point is to recognize that we're essentially at A in this terribly subverted and degenerated and sickly society and culture, and to recognize that Z does indeed exist and that we can get there if we care enough to do so. Lastly, as we engage in these efforts, we shouldn't be too focused on numbers, meaning how many individuals might drift in or out in the Sunday discussions, or how many might be actively involved in the Gilded server, or the up and down vacillation of these numbers. Such efforts always start big and then fall back down to a plateau of the truly and deeply interested, and begin building from here. That's not to say that such numbers are completely meaningless, and very broadly speaking, having more involved is, for the most part, a net positive compared to the opposite. But we need to realize the role being played by those who step forward to be more active in these discussions and these efforts, and the efforts soon to come. You're very much the pioneers, and those intrepid types willing to break new ground and be first on the scene, to prepare the territory for others in the future. This is true both in the ideological and conceptual and theoretical sense, as we discuss and debate and envision, and also in the physical sense, when real-world environments begin to be created. Historically, traditionally, this was a fairly lonely role, or at least one the majority of people aren't cut out for. Just as there's an upside to boosting this number of individuals involved in these earliest efforts, it might fairly be argued that there's an upside to seeing those people who aren't truly and deeply interested fall away. The former boosts the total pool of allies and well-wishers, and the latter culls it to leave the stage open for the most enthusiastic and serious and committed. And it's this small nucleus of serious and capable folks that have the best chance of creating a stable and sturdy and lasting foundation. One of these is often worth 100 or 1,000 of those just vaguely interested, or looking to somehow be intrigued or entertained by the process as a whole. That's not to say we don't want you around if you're merely interested. Perhaps that seed of interest might grow into something real and fundamental over time. It's only to say that the real doers are often a much smaller handful. My own goal in the future is to periodically do what I'm able to draw in the right sorts of people, slowly but surely. But we need to recognize that the majority of the interest will come, as is the case with nearly everything in life, when there's sufficient structure built and foundation laid to where others might get involved a bit more easily and with a vastly simplified and clarified path and plan of action as they do so. It's these initial stages that require a deeply special sort of people, capable of opening the door for all others. If you are one of these, or even just aspire to be in some capacity, I ask that you consider stepping forward and making yourself heard in one way or another, joining our Twitter Spaces discussions on Sunday at noon Pacific Standard Time, 3 p.m. Eastern, and also joining the Gilded server to engage in real-time discussions on everything from land purchases to ideas for intra-community businesses and occupations or new home constructions, and everything related, taking place in between these weekly meetings. Also, importantly, right this moment, we're looking for 1 or 2 additional hosts for these discussions, to allow them to branch off in slightly different directions, to cover more ground, and perhaps make slightly quicker progress toward the overall goal. If you're interested in being one of these, please do reach out and let us know. Ideally on the Gilded server, or to Arval, or Karnak, or myself. I'd love to see someone port these discussions to a non-Twitter platform. I know there's been quite a few people who very much wanted to get involved who simply don't and won't use Twitter for any reason. And there's probably a handful of others, like myself, using older tech or operating systems that can't at the moment do so. And it'd be extremely helpful to harness this energy. Those of you that have any ideas on this front, please do voice them. In summary, this broader idea of parallel communities and structures quite simply is the ideal and necessary path forward. Exactly how it manifests, how quickly it takes shape, and in what form or by what means is something of an open question. But it seems so clear to so many of us that amidst a sea of seemingly hopeless dead ends and bad options, this, by contrast, seems to harbor the potential to be a tremendous net positive and to check so many boxes. A worthy use of time and energy and collective efforts, and perhaps one of the only on the horizon at the moment. So, much appreciation for those involved and those who soon will be. You may be unsung heroes for a while, though of course the best of you don't do it for those reasons anyhow, but rather because it's simply the right thing to do and the right time to do it. Sincere respect for that, and to all of you. And that's about it for now. I hope you're all well, and thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my